There was a moment in 1974 when laughter died in the studio. John Wayne had just made a joke about Lucille Ball's age, and the woman who built her career on comedy didn't laugh at all. What she said next was so quiet, so precise, that even Johnny Carson leaned forward in his chair. And what happened in the silence that followed changed the way two legends saw each other forever. The year was 1974. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was, by then, more than a program. It was an institution. A nightly ritual for millions of Americans who tuned in after the late news, settling into their recliners with a cup of tea or a nightcap, ready to be entertained by the man in the sharp suit behind the desk. Johnny Carson had become a trusted presence, a steady hand guiding viewers through the quirks and contradictions of American life, with wit, warmth, and an uncanny ability to make even the biggest stars feel like guests in a living room. On this particular evening, the marquee names were impossible to ignore. John Wayne, the Duke, the embodiment of American strength and stoicism, was seated to Johnny's right. His presence filled the studio, not just physically, though he was a large man, but spiritually. He carried with him the weight of 100 films, 1,000 scenes of cowboys riding into sunsets, of men who did what needed to be done without complaint. He was a symbol, and symbols, as Johnny knew well, could be difficult to interview. To Johnny's left sat Lucille Ball. If John Wayne represented the mythic American man, Lucy represented the mythic American woman, but in a different key. Where Wayne was granite, Lucy was lightning. Her career had been built not on silence, but on sound. The shriek, the gasp, the perfectly timed "what." She had made millions laugh by turning frustration into farce, by making the domestic extraordinary. She was chaos in a cardigan, and America adored her for it. The audience that night was electric. Two titans, two completely different genres of stardom, sharing the same couch. You could feel the anticipation in the air, the curiosity about how these two forces would interact. Would they clash? Would they connect? Would Johnny, the master mediator, find the common thread? The interview began as interviews often did, with pleasantries, with career retrospectives, with the gentle ribbing that Carson used to put his guests at ease. Johnny asked Wayne about his latest film, about the challenges of shooting on location, about the changing landscape of Hollywood. Wayne answered in his measured, deliberate way, each word chosen like a stone placed carefully in a wall. He spoke of hard work, of loyalty, of the old ways. The audience nodded along. This was the John Wayne they knew. This was the voice of authority. Then Johnny turned to Lucy. He asked about I Love Lucy, about the pressures of being a woman in charge of her own production company, about balancing motherhood with a career that demanded everything. Lucy answered with her trademark energy, her hands moving as she spoke, her eyes sparkling with the memory of scenes long past. She told a story about a mishap on set, about a prop that broke at the worst possible moment, and the audience roared with laughter. It was classic Lucy, self-deprecating, quick, effortlessly funny. And then it happened. Johnny, perhaps sensing an opportunity for some light-hearted interplay between his two very different guests, made a gentle comment about how Lucy seemed to have the energy of someone half her age. It was a compliment, or at least it was intended as one. Lucy smiled, accepted it graciously. But then John Wayne leaned forward slightly, a twinkle in his eye that the cameras caught perfectly, and said, in that deep, familiar drawl, "Well, Johnny, I guess when you spend your life making faces, time doesn't catch up with you the same way." The line landed. Some in the audience chuckled, a nervous, uncertain sound. Others didn't react at all. The comment hung in the air, ambiguous. Was it a joke? Was it a dig? Was it just the Duke being the Duke, speaking without filter as he was known to do? Lucy's expression didn't change immediately. She kept smiling. But those who knew her, those who had worked with her for decades, would later say they saw something flicker in her eyes. A recognition, a calculation. Johnny, ever the professional, tried to steer the conversation forward. He asked Wayne about his thoughts on comedy, on whether he ever considered doing a lighter role. Wayne dismissed the idea with a wave of his hand. "Comedy's a young man's game," he said, almost offhandedly. "You need timing. You need agility." He glanced, just for a moment, in Lucy's direction. The audience grew quiet. Not silent, but quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when people aren't sure how to react, when they're waiting to see what the person who was just the target of a comment will do. Lucy didn't react right away. She adjusted her skirt. She took a slow sip of water from the glass on the table. She looked at Johnny, then at Wayne, then back at Johnny. And in that pause, something shifted in the room. But something about that moment felt unusual. Johnny Carson noticed it immediately. He had spent years reading people, sensing the undercurrents in a conversation. He knew when a guest was genuinely amused, when they were offended, when they were simply playing along. And in that moment, he saw that Lucy Ball was not playing along. He leaned back in his chair, just slightly. A small movement, but one that those who watched him closely would recognize as a signal. He was paying attention now. The interview continued, but the tone had changed. Wayne spoke about his philosophy of filmmaking, about the importance of strong characters and clear morals. Lucy listened, nodding politely, but her responses were shorter, more measured. The easy chemistry that had been building earlier seemed to have evaporated. And then, about 10 minutes into the segment, Johnny asked a question that would change everything. He turned to Lucy and said, "Lucy, you've played so many different roles over the years. Is there one character you wish you'd had the chance to play? Something completely different from what you're known for?" It was a standard question, one he had asked countless guests. But the way Lucy answered was anything but standard. She didn't launch into a story about a dramatic role she'd always wanted. She didn't mention Shakespeare or historical figures. Instead, she looked directly at John Wayne, and she said very calmly, very clearly, "You know, John, I've always admired actors who can say everything they need to say with just a look. No words necessary. It must be freeing." The studio was silent. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for a punchline, not the comfortable silence of a thoughtful moment. This was a different kind of silence, the kind that falls when everyone in the room realizes simultaneously that something significant has just occurred. John Wayne's expression changed. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't gasp or scowl or look away. But those who were watching closely, the audience members in the front rows, the crew behind the cameras, Johnny Carson himself, saw it. The slight tightening around his eyes, the subtle shift in his posture, the way his smile, which had been easy and confident just moments before, became fixed, almost strained. He paused. Lucy didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The implication was clear, and it was devastating in its simplicity. She had taken his earlier comment about faces, about timing, about agility, and reflected it back at him, not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with a quiet, surgical precision that left no room for rebuttal. She had suggested, without ever saying it directly, that perhaps the ability to communicate without words wasn't a strength, but a limitation, that perhaps relying on a look, on a persona, on a myth, was easier than the hard, vulnerable work of crafting a character from the inside out. And she had done it in a way that was impossible to criticize, because on the surface, it sounded like a compliment. Johnny Carson felt the shift in the room like a change in atmospheric pressure. He had seen guests spar before, had even facilitated a few playful debates, but this was different. This wasn't playful. This was a masterclass in verbal judo, and he was watching it unfold in real time. What happened next surprised everyone in the studio. John Wayne didn't respond immediately. He looked down at his hands, which were resting on his knees. He took a slow breath, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than it had been all evening. "That's an interesting way to look at it, Lucy." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of fault, but it was an acknowledgement. And in the world of live television, where egos were often larger than life, an acknowledgement was a rare and powerful thing.
The audience, sensing that they had witnessed something real, something unscripted, began to applaud. Not the polite, obligatory applause that often follows a joke, but a warmer, more sustained round of clapping. It was applause for the moment itself, for the unexpected turn the conversation had taken, for the quiet dignity with which Lucy had handled a potentially hurtful comment. Johnny, recognizing that the energy in the room had shifted, decided to move the interview forward. He asked Wayne about his upcoming projects, asked Lucy about her plans for the next season of her show. The conversation returned to safer ground. But something had changed. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a new kind of respect, a tentative, hard-won respect that felt more genuine than the pleasantries that had come before. And that was the moment Johnny Carson realized something was very wrong. Not wrong in the sense of a disaster or a scandal, but wrong in the sense that the story he thought he was telling, the light-hearted chat between two legends, was not the story that was actually unfolding. The real story was quieter, more subtle, and far more powerful. It was a story about pride, about perception, about the ways we underestimate each other based on the roles we play. He made a mental note to revisit this moment later, in the quiet of his office, when the cameras were off and the audience had gone home. Because he knew, with the instinct of a great storyteller, that this was more than just a funny moment on late-night television. This was a moment that revealed something true about two of the most iconic figures in American entertainment. The interview wound down. Johnny thanked his guests, the audience applauded, and the credits began to roll. John Wayne and Lucille Ball stood, shook hands, exchanged a few polite words. To the casual observer, it looked like any other ending to any other interview. But those who were paying attention saw the glance that passed between them. Not a look of anger or resentment or even triumph, but a look of recognition, of understanding. They had tested each other in the most public way possible, and they had both emerged with something new, a deeper appreciation for the craft of the other. The cameras stopped rolling, the audience began to file out, the crew started to break down the set, and in the controlled chaos that follows a live broadcast, Johnny Carson remained seated at his desk for a moment longer than usual. He was thinking about what had just happened, about the power of a single sentence delivered at the right moment, in the right way, about the ways in which we all carry assumptions about each other, assumptions that can be challenged, changed, even shattered in the space of a breath. He picked up his pen and made a note in the margin of his interview outline. Lucy Wayne, the look. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The memory was enough. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened after the cameras cut, in the quiet of the backstage area, is where the real truth of that evening lies. A truth that was never broadcast, never reported in the newspapers, never discussed in the biographies that followed. A truth that was preserved only in the memories of a handful of people who were there, and in the private papers of Johnny Carson himself. And that truth begins with a conversation that took place in Johnny's office, just minutes after the show ended. Lucy Ball was the first to arrive. She knocked softly on the open door, and Johnny looked up from his desk. "Got a minute, Johnny?" she asked. "Always, Lucy," he replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. She sat down, but not in her usual animated way. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. For a moment, she didn't speak. She just looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "That was quite a moment out there," Johnny said gently. Lucy nodded. It was. Another pause. Then she said, "I didn't mean to embarrass him." Johnny waited. He knew better than to fill the silence. I've spent my whole life being underestimated," she continued, her voice low. "Not just as a woman, but as a comedian. People think because you make them laugh, you're not serious, that you don't have depth, that you're lightweight." She looked down at her hands. "And maybe that's true, sometimes. Maybe I have played into that, but it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt." Johnny nodded slowly. He understood. Better than most. He had built a career on being the observer, the commentator, the man who stood slightly apart from the spectacle. He knew what it was to be perceived in a certain way, to have your complexities reduced to a single note. "John Wayne is a legend," Lucy said, "and he deserves to be. But legends can cast long shadows. And sometimes in those shadows, it's easy to forget that everyone else is just trying." She looked up at Johnny then, and her eyes were bright, but not with tears, with conviction. "I didn't say what I said to win," she said. "I said it because I wanted him to see me, not the character, not the icon, just me." Johnny was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "He saw you, Lucy." She smiled, a small private smile. "I hope so." A few minutes later, John Wayne knocked on the doorframe. "Mind if I join you two?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Johnny gestured to the other chair. Wayne sat down, his large frame filling the space. He looked at Lucy, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Wayne said, "I owe you an apology, Lucy." Lucy shook her head. "You don't owe me anything, John." "Yes, I do," he insisted. "I made a comment that was careless, and I see now that it wasn't just careless, it was disrespectful." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've spent my career playing men who don't show much, who keep their feelings to themselves. And maybe I've started to believe that that's the only way to be strong. But watching you tonight, watching how you handled that moment, it reminded me that strength comes in different forms." He looked at her directly. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for, Lucy, and I'm sorry for that." Lucy reached across the small space between them and placed her hand on his. Just for a moment, a gesture of forgiveness, of understanding, of shared humanity. "Thank you, John," she said softly. They sat in silence for a while, the three of them, in the quiet of the office after the storm of the broadcast. The sounds of the studio fading away, the lights dimmed, the day's work done. And in that silence, something passed between them that was more valuable than any rating, any review, any headline. Something real. Something human. Johnny Carson watched them, and he felt a familiar sensation. The sense that he was witnessing something that mattered. Not just for television, but for life. He would never talk about that backstage conversation on air. It wasn't his story to tell, but he would carry it with him. A private reminder of the power of a single moment to change the way two people see each other. And perhaps, in its own small way, to change the way we all see each other. Because that's the thing about moments like these. They don't just belong to the people who experience them. They ripple outward, touching everyone who hears about them, who remembers them, who learns from them. The story of what happened between John Wayne and Lucille Ball on The Tonight Show in 1974 is not a story of conflict or victory or defeat. It is a story of recognition, of two artists at the peak of their fame realizing that the person they had underestimated had something to teach them. And it is a story about the power of words, not the loud, boastful words that fill the air, but the quiet, precise words that cut through the noise and reach the heart. Lucy Ball didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to make a scene. She simply said what needed to be said, in the way that only someone with her mastery of language and timing could. And in doing so, she didn't just defend herself. She opened a door that allowed John Wayne to see her, truly see her for the first time. And perhaps in seeing her, to see something in himself that he had overlooked. That is the hidden truth of that night. Not a scandal, not a feud, not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, profound moment of mutual respect, born from a challenge, delivered with grace and received with humility. It is a reminder that even legends are human, that even icons have moments of doubt, of insecurity, of growth, and that sometimes the most powerful thing one person can say to another is not a compliment or a criticism, but a simple, honest observation that invites them to see themselves and each other more clearly. The Tonight Show went on, of course. Johnny Carson hosted thousands more episodes, welcomed countless more guests, created countless more moments that would be remembered, rewatched, cherished. But the night in 1974, when John Wayne and Lucille Ball shared that couch, remained special. Not because of what was broadcast, but because of what wasn't. Because sometimes the most important moments in television history are the ones that happen after the cameras stop rolling. The moments of connection, of understanding, of quiet transformation that never make it to air, but that change the people involved in ways that echo through the rest of their lives. And perhaps, in their own way, through the rest of ours. Because when we watch those old episodes now, when we see John Wayne and Lucille Ball sitting side by side, laughing at Johnny's jokes, we are seeing more than just a talk show segment. We are seeing a testament to the complexity of human relationships, to the ways in which we can hurt each other, accidentally or otherwise, and the ways in which we can heal those hurts if we are brave enough to try. We are seeing a reminder that respect is not something you demand, but something you earn, and that sometimes earning it requires nothing more than a single sentence, spoken at the right moment, with the right intention. Lucy Ball lived for many more years after that night. She continued to work, to create, to make people laugh. John Wayne did the same, though his health would decline in the years that followed. They never appeared together on The Tonight Show again. But those who knew them both would later say that something shifted between them after that evening. A new warmth, a new ease, a new understanding. And Johnny Carson, whenever he was asked about his favorite moments from the show, would sometimes mention that night. Not for the comedy, not for the controversy, but for the humanity. For the reminder that even in the brightest lights, with millions watching, the most powerful moments are often the quietest ones. The ones that happen in the spaces between the words. The ones that change not just the course of a conversation, but the course of a relationship. The ones that remind us that behind every legend, there is a person. And behind every person, there is a story waiting to be seen, if only we take the time to look. So the next time you watch an old episode of The Tonight Show and you see John Wayne and Lucille Ball sharing that couch, remember this. You are not just watching a piece of television history. You are watching a moment of human connection, a moment of growth, a moment of grace. And perhaps in your own way, you are invited to reflect on the moments in your own life when a single sentence, spoken with care, changed the way you saw someone or the way someone saw you. Because that is the legacy of that night in 1974. Not a headline, not a soundbite, but a simple, enduring truth. That we are all more than the roles we play, and that sometimes all it takes is one person seeing us, truly seeing us, to remind us of that. If you remember watching Johnny Carson during those years, if you have a memory of that night, or of any of the moments we've shared here, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us where you used to watch the show. Tell us what you felt when you saw these legends interact. Your stories, your memories are part of this history too. We invite you to share them in the comments below. Because in the end, television is not just about what happens on the screen. It's about what happens in our hearts when we watch it. And those are the stories worth telling.